All right, so this is Yahweh Liu. As Peter mentioned, I work for President Carter. As you all know, he was the one responsible for normalizing U.S.-China relationship, and now he's in hospice, and we are all concerned, and we wish that he can live at least into 99 years old, which is going to be October the 1st. This year. He shared the same birthday with the most populous country in the world. I wish that Peter can tell more stories. I think his stories are actually a very good reflection of the rise and down of this relationship. So very quickly, in 15, 20 minutes, I want to share with you the past, present, and future of U.S.-China relations. Right now in China, there's a very commonly used phrase called the changes unseen in 100 years. 百年未遇之大变局. Today, I want to focus on the second half of this 100 years. If you look at the first 100 years, that is basically from 1923 all the way to 1973, 72. I think if you look at totality of Chinese history, that first 50 years is the darkest page of recent Chinese history. I'm not going to get into the details. The second 50 years start with 1972. Nixon made the trip. Why did Nixon make the trip to China? And of course, Nixon had no political risk to visit China because his whole political career, as you guys are from California, is anti-China, anti-communism. So when he said he was going to go to China, no one would accuse him of being surrendering to the Chi-Com. And his idea at the time is he was aware China was poor. He was aware China was not powerful, but he's always a forward-looking guy, and he has this vision, considering the size, population, the long history of China. He felt China eventually is going to become a superpower, and U.S. cannot tolerate a China, whose leader, day in, day out, were calling the Chinese people to work hard to overthrow the United States. So he wanted to change China. And of course, at the same time, the short-term goal is to get China to counter the Soviet Union. Peter mentioned that, the first 10 years. I'll talk about that later. So all of you knew about this visit. So I'm not going to talk about the specifics of this visit, other than to say this is the beginning of the American policy that we call engagement. However, Nixon was not the one that normalized the relationship. The American who normalized the relationship, and he worked very closely with Deng Xiaoping, was my boss. As I mentioned earlier, President Jimmy Carter. So the normalization communique, 建交公报, was put out in December the 15th, 1978. Peter remembered all the details of his 30-year-old company. I remember this moment because I was a freshman in college. I heard this news. I was flabbergasted because we couldn't believe that the best country, China, could normalize relationship with the worst country, the United States at the time. And President Carter, unlike Nixon, ran a huge political risk. And people basically said, you do this, you're not going to be able to win re-election. One thing I want to highlight is this decision, Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter, a decision to normalize a relationship, was only 3 days away from the other very momentous domestic decision made in China, and that is the third plenum of the 11th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, 11届三中全会. So for all those who came from China, particularly Peter and Rong Cai, and I guess we're all the same generation, we all know what that meeting means. And this is the era of honeymoon that Peter talked about. Just look at the body language of President Carter and Deng Xiaoping, Zhao Ziyang and Ronald Reagan, Li Xianyan and Reagan, and particularly in February 1989, when Bush, he attended the funeral of the emperor in Japan, and he wanted to visit China, and he particularly asked whether he could stop in the Tiananmen Square, where he and the First Lady Barbara used to bike through, because he was the second American representative in the liaison office in Beijing. And Peter also mentioned about this very tragic and unfortunate event. Again, for people our generation, we know this very well. For those younger generation, if you don't know this, I think you should just look it up, Google it. This is when the honeymoon finally ended. But Peter also talked about, the Bush senior. He sent his national security advisor, General Scowcroft, to Beijing in July. This was a secret trip. And Scowcroft told Deng Xiaoping, we have to sanction. Many of the sanctions that U.S. imposed after 1989 are still in place today. But he also told Deng Xiaoping, we're not going to kick you out. We're not going to disengage. We're not going to decouple. And of course, Peter's company was founded in 1993. I would think without the tour, the Southern tour of 1992, we probably would not have approved Peter, to register and license his company here. So these two events, 1992南巡, Southern tour of 1992, as well as the 1989 secret visit by General Scowcroft, contributed to the fact that the train of China's opening up and reform was still on the tracks. And the rest, we can say, is history. Without that tour, without 改革开放 on the tracks, China's economy, if you look at where China's economy was in the 1980s and where it is now, you understand how important this relationship is. Of course, China's economic takeoff had many things to do with other countries, but the US certainly is one of the most important engines of this economic growth. As China's power, both military, but more so economic power growth, things began to shift. So here, there are different moments of the paradigm shift. I think this is the beginning of people questioning whether US engagement policy is a wrong decision, whether China is going to get closer to US politically and ideologically. And more American government officials, scholars, elite, advisors to the decision makers feel like US played a very important role in growing China's economy, but China is not getting closer. China is not getting more intimate with the US, and China certainly was trying very hard to reject values and other things represented by the US. And US wants to see these changes in China. So this is the beginning of the so-called hedging. So engagement is still there, but containment has got into the discourse. So we call this congagement. I'm not going to go through again the specific sort of paradigm shift and who are the leaders at the time. And now, of course, the 2016 election, Trump was elected, and he was like a bull, and he ran into the China shop. Now, before he ran into the China shop, the China side, the Chinese leader, made a huge investment, made a big effort to basically get Trump in line, not to disengage. And he probably was misled by the advisors or by the conventional wisdom that Trump only focuses on deals. So if you're going to offer enough deals to him, then you'll be able to get him in line. So Xi Jinping made a trip to Mar-a-Lago in April 2017. And then in November, Trump paid a state visit to China Xi Jinping was literally a tour guide to American president in the Forbidden City. And then in the Great Hall of the People, deals was signed worth, I think, $240 billion. At that point, I think the leaders in China felt this is it. We're going to have a good old 4 years. But that was not the case. The trade war started in 2018. Now, going forward to 2021, when Biden came into the office, the expectation is Biden was going to be different from Trump, that Biden knew China so much better than any other American president. Just the meetings he had with Xi Jinping in private one-on-one was over 40 hours. Even during his campaign in 2020 in Iowa, he mentioned that, to think that China is going to steal our lunch, that's not going to happen. That's not possible. China has so many problems. So based on all of this, the calculation is President Biden probably will revise President Trump's China policy. Well, to the shock of almost everyone in China and many here in the US, not only President Biden did not change Trump's China policy, he has made it even worse and more efficient and more effective. So the thing, I think two things happened. Number one is this perception that was started by Trump, but it was deepened and expanded by the Biden's team. That is, China poses an existential threat to the United States. China's threat is bigger than Russia, even though Russia is actually fighting a war in Ukraine. But long-term speaking, China poses that threat. The second is President Biden and his team doesn't believe US can get the job done by itself. So it's getting all the other countries onto the bandwagon to form this encirclement of China. So this is basically, getting Japan, getting India, getting EU, getting South Korea, getting Vietnam, getting all these other countries, to come in line behind the US in this gigantic, almost epic effort to contain the rise of China. So I just want to give you this very quick quote from Biden. So we see his true, maybe you can use the term ugly nature of his China policy. China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. I mean, there's nothing wrong with any country's leader to say, we want to be the most powerful country in the world. We want our people to be the wealthiest. We want our country to have bigger economic and political influence in the world. There's nothing wrong. But for you to say, no, that's not going to happen under my watch. I'm going to do everything possible to make China's aspiration dead. I think that's quite vicious and quite ugly. And I think that's probably is the nature of US policy toward China. So the American strategy is invest at home. Our previous speakers talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Act, and all the other ones. Second is build up allies that I just talked about. And third is compete with China. Every domestic agenda, I guess, other than cultural wars, other than abortion, everything else the Biden team is doing, basically they will say that we do this so that we can better compete with China. And since, this is Silicon Valley, and this is where decoupling is happening every day. Taijidian is setting up a shop in Phoenix, Arizona, and China is investigating Micron and the chip war between the two countries. You talk about the AI, I think being denied access to super quantum computing, being denied access to the most advanced chips. China's alleged advance in the AI area probably will not be sustained because the software, the algorithm, they all are dependent on faster and more productive chips over here. So Huawei, of course, is a good example, how US is designing all this very precise strategy to deal with each and every innovative Chinese company that is taking more and more market share. And Huawei was on the chopping board. It was the first Chinese company to have done that. And US, not only US is doing this, and American government officials, diplomats, they're talking to every leader in every country to pressure them to cut off their deal with Huawei. And we all know, how Huawei has suffered as a result. Now, of course, people say it's very hard to decouple. If you look at all the numbers of trade, and particularly the trade of 2022, but the overall trend for Peter, your company, you do a lot of analysis. Is you see the portion of China trade over vis-a-vis other U.S. trade with other countries. I think in totality, it is declining. Maybe we're still encouraged by the numbers of 2022, but things may change big time this year and in the coming years. Of course, we always say it's better for U.S. and China not to decouple. So in the area of conventional security challenges, if you look at the list, there are 7 issues here. There are a lot more. If U.S. and China are not going to work together, then all of these local crises could potentially escalate into regional and even global crises. And of course, on these non-conventional security challenges, they're even more urgent. We talk about renewable energy. This is where U.S. and China can collaborate. Ron Tsai talked about how U.S. is imposing tariff on solar panels, although U.S. was not able to complete a production line over here. But the U.S. at the same time is going after Chinese companies initially in China, and now Chinese companies in the 4 countries that Ron talked about. And of course, pandemic and climate change, these are all urgent issues. But at this moment, both leaders are talking about very much needed, necessary collaborations, but they're not working on that. And I'm not going to go through what will happen if U.S. and China do decouple. It's unthinkable. And on the personal level, Peter mentioned, we're all here. We should be bridges. We should try to make our American colleagues, American friends, American neighbors, as well as American leaders to have a better perception of China, but also to convince people in China that China doesn't harbor any resentment against the U.S., that 2 countries can work together. But right now, the trend line seems to imply that's not the case, although I don't think we should give up our effort. We should not give up our endeavor, our hope that we should work tirelessly on this. Of course, the key thing here is Taiwan. Taiwan now is the most dangerous place under the sun. Although many people believe, U.S. is not going to fight a war, but I think U.S. is doing everything now to provoke China, and they probably also hope that China is going to be so angry that they're going to lose their rational thinking and they're going to make a reckless decision to use force against Taiwan. That certainly will be leading to a second darkest page in China's recent history. 51 years ago, Nixon visited Taiwan. We look at that. and then 50 years later, Putin come into town, and that created another turning point. So if bad things are going to happen to China, I don't think we can only blame American leaders. I don't think we can only blame the Chinese leaders. We should also blame Putin, who is so calculating and who probably has entrapped China and may make China go down a road that is of no return. So this is the recent balloon incident. I want to highlight this chart here is 83% of the American people have a very negative view of China. So that's how daunting our work is, that we need to do everything possible. Hopefully we can change the American perception, but regardless of how hard we're trying, if we cannot get people in China, particularly the leaders, to stop doing something, I don't think we can make a huge difference over here. So this is the most recent China policy as being described by Janet Yellen, who may be going to China very soon. So number one is national security. So US is willing to sacrifice its economic interest to guarantee that China is not going to be a military power that will threaten the US. Second, US does want to have a healthy economic relationship. So I think that's why the Silicon Valley Entrepreneurial Forum is so important, because this forum is contributing to the work, of establishing a sustainable, healthy economic relationship between US and China. We all need to look into this, to work very hard. And finally is the global challenges that the two countries have to work together. So this, maybe by looking at what happened in Hiroshima, Japan, and at the same time what happened in my city, Xi'an, you probably will draw a tentative conclusion. These two countries are now on separate tracks. What do these tracks mean? You look at this picture of the G7, you look at this picture, in addition to G7, who are the other leaders that came to G7? You can see the pressure is on. At the same time, China is meeting with leaders from those poor Central Asian countries. What kind of difference can they make? And also the simplicity of the G7 and the complexity of this meeting in Xi'an also has a lot for us to look at and to assess. So I want to end my presentation by saying, so this relationship is in tremendous difficult. Number two, the Vienna meeting may point to some silver linings of the gathering dark cloud. So this November, APEC meeting is going to be held in San Francisco, where you guys are. Whether President Xi Jinping is going to come, how much time he will have with Biden is very, very important. I want to tell everyone, and I hope you guys are going to be interested in this, is on January the 11th, 2024, we're going to commemorate the 45th anniversary of the normalization of US-China relations. Maybe in November, we'll do a small event in San Francisco, on the margins of the APEC meeting. So I'll keep Peter and everyone else informed, and hopefully you guys can join us and we can join you to do this work together so that this relationship is not going to be a sinking ship. We want to make this ship floating well and into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu. 太精彩了，我真的是不忍心，不好意思跟那个钉钉电视，因为他讲到最新的东西，这个是打动我们的地方啊。中亚峰会，如果大家看新闻的话，大家4个峰会和这个G7这个区别， Luckily 刘教授会到我们这里来，因为 Apex 在我们旧金山举行，所以说我们是这个享受地利能够再次见证中美关系的另外一个发展和转折。刘教授您讲这些东西对我们来说也是教益非常深。跟您报告一下，就是说这些年我已经连续7次10年将近到 Mission to Washington 做这个 lobbyist。但是呢，我不是代表中国，我是代表我们这个行业，代表我们这进出口行业、贸易行业、运输行业，来促进这个中美的这个技术交流和这个经贸交流。这个 decoupling 是脱钩，也可以说是字面上是离异。但是呢，我们汪洋副总理在2014年讲过，中美是夫妻关系。这个在按照中国的这个法律的话，中国的习惯，一方要离，另外一方不让离，咱们还是先拖着吧，好吧？
再次的感谢大家，到这儿的时间就差不多了。我们把这个灯光打开之后呢，我们就开始吃饭。大家拿了饭到桌上以后呢，我们再把麦克风传递给大家，来互相介绍一下。我们这次呢再次鸣谢美国大威国际有限公司、中科大硅谷校友会、科明基金、Peter Gong、Stanley Wang、熊刚、Diana Ding、董贵强、Tom Ying 以及筹备组和全体义工志愿者为这次论坛付出的巨大努力。他们其实这已经忙了1个多月的时间了，而且今天所有布置场地的人提前几个小时就在这儿，让我们再一次把掌声给他们，谢谢大家，谢谢。好，那食物已经基本上准备好了，我们大家等一下就去拿了食物之后呢，坐回到桌上以后呢，我们就把麦克风传递一下，我们现场互相介绍一下，大家认识一下 networking。整一下午的时间，辛苦大家了，谢谢你们，也谢谢你们来到钉钉电视，谢谢。